In our last session, we've explored two very different ways of understanding God's relationship to time. The first view we looked at argued that God is outside of time. This is the more classical view. He doesn't move from moment to moment, but he possesses his entire life in one single eternal act. The second view argued that God is in time. God experiences succession. He responds to events and has an unfolding story. Both views have strengths and weaknesses, and the weaknesses seem to be really big challenges. So maybe there's a view that could capitalize on some of the strengths of each view and minimize the weaknesses. Well, in this session, we're going to consider the third of our four views. God enters time. This view states that God is timeless apart from creation and temporal with creation. In other words, God enters into temporal existence when he creates. All right, let's start by considering a bit more of the biblical story than we've looked at so far and ask the question, did time itself have a beginning? Many Christian theologians and philosophers have agreed that yes, in fact, the opening lines of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, mean to signify more than just the beginning of matter, but also refers to the beginning of time itself. If time begins with creation, then there was no temporal reality prior to creation. And by prior, we don't mean like prior in time, right? But more like logically prior, without creation. What we mean is that a succession of moments began with creation. God's act of creating is also the creation of time. That's when moments begin. Jude speaks of God existing before all time. Paul talks about God's grace being given before the ages began. Scripture speaks of God and his purposes existing before the foundations of the world and before the ages. And then we have the tension of the unfolding story of God, acting to create, relating to his creation, conversing with humans, and so on. Is the Bible speaking out of both sides of its mouth? God exists without time, prior to time, but relates to people in time? Can he transcend time yet act in time? If God is atemporal in his being, yet enters into a succession of moments with his act of creating, maybe this explains things. This is a view that could potentially reconcile the tensions that we see, and not just in the biblical passages, but also in the philosophical thought of the day. Like the temporal view we explored in the last session, this position rests on a dynamic understanding of time. The present is all that exists. The past is gone, and the future is not here yet. Reality is unfolding. However, the continual succession of moments could not have begun an infinite number of moments ago, which is to say, it never had a beginning. Well, it had to have a beginning in order to ever get to this present moment, or we run into that problem of infinite regress. So there was a first moment, that makes sense, and a succession of moments will have followed ever since, and will potentially always continue into the future. So philosophically speaking, something independent of the universe had to be the catalyst for creation, right? And therefore, the beginning of time. Well, God fits the bill as the uncaused cause of creation. God, therefore, without creation, or logically prior to creation, is independent of time, in the same way that he's independent of space. That being, God, is self-existent. He's just existing in a timeless state of being. Now, often it's hard for us to imagine a being in timeless existence. That's probably because we all experience sequence. Any change indicates a succession of moments, time. Any thought that we have happens in sequence, doesn't it? We go from thinking about one thing, thinking about another, and that maybe brings about another thought, and so on. And so our processes of living and thinking are directly connected to time. But is this a necessary condition for a being to exist? Well, no. God simply exists. Without creation, there need not be any change in God. No succession of moments is needed. I mean, think about this. If God holds all thoughts equally present in his mind, then there is no process of thinking. God just is. God just knows. This is actually exactly the kind of being you would expect to find if the universe, that is, time, space, energy, and matter, all came into existence. An intelligent agent capable of acting who is extremely powerful, creative, self-existent, dependent upon nothing else. Think about it. Well, if time came into existence, then this being also needs to be outside of time. However, with the creation of time, all things, time included, now there becomes a moment of creation that leads to a next moment, and so on. So this self-existent, timeless being would have now changed. There would have been an action. God would enter into a story with creation. God in some way humbled himself in the act of creating. He entered time. Now, interacting with his creation, entering into dynamic relationships with the beings that he created. Now, this isn't to say that God is dependent on time. I mean, he created it, but in the creation of it, he now stands in a real relation to it, which includes real relations to temporal events. This would mean that God can know when now is. There was a time, bang, big bang, right? Everything created. There was a time when God made a covenant with Abraham that is continuing to be fulfilled. There was a time that Jesus died on the cross, and then there was a time 3 days later that he resurrected. That's in the past, even for God. There will be a time that he returns. There will be a resurrection of the dead and the full establishment of a heavenly kingdom, and that's in the future. God can still remain immutable, kind of like the temporalist view, because he's immutable in his character and nature, while having all the qualities depicted in the story of God from Scripture. This view allows for true free will.
But they'll never take our freedom!
The future is not set or determined. God still knows all things that can be known. Now, are there any drawbacks to this view? Well, I mean, some would say so. First, there's something of a question in the transition into time. If a timeless being transitions into time, there's a before that point, which seems like it may indicate a time prior to the start of time, and that's not rational. Also, did God change from being atemporal to being temporal? That seems to be a change more than just experiential change. This objection, of course, comes from those who think of immutability as a necessary property of God in which no change of any sort could ever take place for him to be a perfect being. So that's the same kind of challenge as it was for the temporalist view, okay, depending on where you go with immutability. Third, this view will still also challenge that classical view of divine simplicity. It's related to immutability, but a new relationship with creation introduces complexity into God's life that wasn't there before. In some ways, this view doesn't just take on the strengths of the other two views, it may take on some of the weaknesses of them as well. Well, at this point, we've explored three major ways of understanding God's relationship to time. We looked at God outside of time, God inside of time, God timeless without creation, temporal with creation. We called that the God enters time view. Each view attempts to make sense of the biblical data and take into account philosophical reasoning about God's nature that squares with Scripture. Well, each view also comes with some drawbacks. Now, all three of these views are operating with an underlying assumption that we mentioned back in the introduction. And that's the fact that we are thinking of time as a succession of moments. Well, in the upcoming last session, I'm going to invite you to take a little step back and ask, what if that assumption is wrong? What if our understanding of time is off? How might that reshape things? What other alternatives might that open up? Let's explore that in session 5. See you there.